Good morning, dear students. Today we have to finish this lesson, right? And we have decided to start yesterday. So, without getting delay, let's get started. Mrs. Fitzgerald, wailing, "Oh dear, I ought to have known." George, staring at her, annoyed, "You ought to have known. Why ought you to have known? Nothing to do with Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at sixes and sevens here just now, so perhaps you will excuse us." Mrs. Pearson, before Mrs. Fitzgerald can reply, "I won't excuse you, George Pearson. Next time a friend and a neighbor comes to see me, just say something when you see her. Good evening, or how did you do? Or something, and don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's a bad manners." Mrs. Fitzgerald said, nervously, "No, it's all right." Mrs. Pearson, "No, it's not all right. We all have some decent manners in the house, or I will know the reason why." Glaring at George, "Well, George, intimidated. Well, what?" Mrs. Pearson, taunting, "Why don't you get off to your club? Special night tonight, isn't it? They will be waiting for you, wanting to have a good laugh. Go on then. Don't disappoint them." George bitterly, "That's right. Make me look silly in front of her now. Go on. Don't mind me sixes and sevens, poor Doris." Doris been crying her eyes out, getting the neighbors in to see the fun, suddenly losing his temper, glaring at Mrs. Pearson and shouting, "All right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone barmy or what?" Mrs. Pearson, jumping up savagely, "If you shout at me, right, again like that, George Pearson, I will slap you, big fat silly face." Right. Mrs. Fitzgerald moaning, "Oh, no, no, no. Please, Mrs. Fitzgerald." Mrs. Pearson sits. George staring at her bewildered. "Either I am off my chump or you two are. How did you mean?" "No, no, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald." "Look, you are Mrs. Fitzgerald. So why you are telling yourself to stop when you are not doing anything? Tell her to stop. Then there will be some sense in it." Staring at Mrs. Pearson, "I think you must be tidily." Mrs. Pearson, starting up savagely, "Say that again, George Pearson." George, intimidated, all right. Doris enters, left slowly, miserable. She is still wearing the wrap, and Mrs. Pearson sits on the settee. Right. So here, Mrs. Fitzgerald, actually who was Mrs. Pearson, immediately interrupts in the communication. On seeing her family at unease, the real Mrs. Pearson forgot that she is in the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald. And right, George is now annoyed at Mrs. Fitzgerald for being concerned and acts as if it her own family matter. He feels she is interfering in his family matters. He tells her to let them solve their issues on their own by leaving their house. And Mrs. Pearson immediately interferes and scolds George for being disrespectful. She tells him to be a bit polite for the visitors and sitting without greeting them. Mrs. Fitzgerald is all awkward in the situation and tells Mrs. Pearson that she is no problem. Right. And Mrs. Pearson declares that definitely it was wrong and her family will have to act disciplined and respectful. George is scared and acts if he didn't understand. He asked to repeat, and Mrs. Pearson replied in taunting way and asked George to go to the club. She tells him he should hurry, for his friends would be waiting for him. He must not disappoint them. George tells Mrs. Pearson that's right. He asks her to proceed and not mind her presence while laughing at him in front of the neighbors. In the process, he loses his cool and starts shouting about Doris crying. Then he asks her what was wrong with her, if she have gone crazy. Mrs. Pearson springs up and reacts immediately. She warns him if he ever used the tone, so she will slap him. Mrs. Fitzgerald tries to calm down Mrs. Pearson, and the process he accidentally calls Mrs. Fitzgerald. George is started by this and says is to who is not his senses of Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson, because these two have been acting very weirdly. He doesn't even understand why she was calling Mrs. Fitzgerald, right? And he finds it odd that she is telling herself to stop doing something she is not doing in the first place. He is of the opinion that he would make more senses if he stopped Mrs. Pearson. And Mrs. Pearson gets heated up again. George is intimidated and accepts. And Doris enters slowly from the left side. She looks sad. She is wearing the wrap. Miss Pearson is sitting over the city. Right. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Hello, Doris dear. Doris miserably. Hello, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I thought you were going out with Charlie Spence tonight. Doris annoyed. What's that to do with you? Mrs. Pearson sharply. Stop that. Mrs. Fitzgerald nervously. No, it's all right. Mrs. Pearson severely. It's not all right. I won't have a daughter of mine taking to anybody like that. Not answer Mrs. Fitzgerald properly, Doris, or go upstairs. Doris looks wonderingly at her father. George, in despair, don't look at me. I give it up. I just give it up. Mrs. Pearson fiercely. Well, answer her sulkily. I was going out with Charlie Spence tonight, but now I have called it off. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Oh, what a pity, dear. Why have you? Doris, with a flash of temper. Because if you must know, my mother has been going on at me, making me feel miserable, and saying he's got buck teeth and is half-witted. Mrs. Fitzgerald, rather bolder, to Mrs. Pearson. Oh, you shouldn't have said that. Mrs. Pearson sharply. Mrs. Fitzgerald, I will manage my family. You manage yours. George grimly, ticking her off now. Are you Annie? Mrs. Pearson even more grimly. They are waiting for you at the club. George, don't forget, and don't you start crying again, Doris. Mrs. Fitzgerald getting up with sudden decision. That's enough. Quite enough. George and Doris stared at her, bewildered. To George and Doris, now listen, you two. I want to have a private little talk with Mrs. Fitz. She corrects herself hastily with Mrs. Pearson, so I will be highly obliged if you will leave us alone for a few minutes. I will let you know when we have finished. Go on, please. Promise you that you won't regret it. There is something here that only I can deal with. George, rising. I am glad somebody can, cause I can't. Come on, Doris. George and Doris exits left. As they go, Mrs. Fitzgerald moves to left of small table and sits. She eagerly beckons to Mrs. Pearson. Do the same thing. Right. So when Doris enters with her pale-looking words than before, Mrs. Fitzgerald greets her politely, and thou a terrible state of mind, she greets her back. Mrs. Fitzgerald again forgetting who she actually is, and she asked about Charlie Spence, and Doris was already annoyed, so she replied in irritating tone. Mrs. Pearson, in a bid to continue what she has been doing all the day, interrupts and starts Doris from behaving that way. Mrs. Fitzgerald again says that it's fine, but Mrs. Pearson interrupted and asked Doris to make it clear that she has to speak politely, otherwise she can go upside. Doris is shocked and responds to her at her response and looks at her father astonishingly. George, having lost all his hope about Mrs. Pearson, tells Doris that even he can't make the situation better because he has given up. Mrs. Pearson, stern on her stand, ordered Doris to answer Mrs. Fitzgerald properly, and Doris gives a calm reply that she has cancelled the plan because of her mother. Mrs. Fitzgerald just gets concerned and asks the reasons. So Doris getting angry again and begins telling Mrs. Fitzgerald how her mother, Mrs. Pearson, had been behaving all day. She says that Mrs. Pearson had been finding a ways to make her feel uncomfortable about Charlie Spence and commenting about his apprentice and appearance and intelligence. Mrs. Fitzgerald now turns a bit bold and asked Mrs. Pearson not to do that. Mrs. Pearson bluntly tells Mrs. Fitzgerald to stay out of the family matters. George barks and asks Mrs. Pearson if she is going to behave this way. Mrs. Pearson immediately replies George and tells him that his friends must be waiting for him at the club. Right. And Mrs. Fitzgerald finally decides to take a stance and tell George and Doris to leave both of them so that they can talk in private, and in the process she was again about to call her wrongly, but somehow handles the situation. When George comments that he is relieved to hear that at least someone can handle the situation because he knows that he can't. Both of them leave the scene, and actually Mrs. Pearson moves towards the table expecting Mrs. Fitzgerald to do the same. Mrs. Fitzgerald, we must change the back now. We really must. Mrs. Pearson, why? Mrs. Fitzgerald, because this gone far too enough. I can see they are all miserable. I can't bear it. Mrs. Pearson, a bit more of the same would do them good, making a great difference already. She moves to right of the table and sits. Mrs. Fitzgerald, no, I can't stand any more of it. I really can't. We must change back. Hurry up, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Pearson, well, if you insist. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, I do, please, please. She stretches her hand across the table eagerly. Mrs. Pearson takes them. Mrs. Pearson, quiet now, relax. Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald stared at each other, muttering exactly as before. Arastata dum dum, arastata dum lam, arastata lam dum bona. They carry out the same action as before, going lax and then coming to life, but this time, of course, they become their proper personalities. Mrs. Fitzgerald, ah, well, I enjoyed that. Mrs. Pearson, I didn't. Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, you ought to have done. Now listen. Mrs. Pearson, don't go soft on them again, else it's all I have been wasted. Mrs. Pearson, I will not try to. I will try not to. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald, they haven't had long as I would like to have given them another hour or two. Rough treatment might have made it certain. Mrs. Pearson, I am sure they will do better now. Though I don't know how I am going to explain. Mrs. Fitzgerald, severely, don't you start any explaining or apologizing, or you done for. Right. So here, she tells Mrs. Pearson that the time they should switch their places back. Mrs. Pearson asks her why she was asking this. So she replies the reason behind that, because she was having a look that her family was troubling, her family was getting troubles, and she can't even see that, right? So she wants them to change back their original selves. As she moves and sits on the side of other tables, she tells Mrs. Fitzgerald it will be better for them to have a test of this medicine for a bit longer. She tells her that a lot of progress has been made already, but a little more effort would do wonders. She stays on her opinions and wants to switch back. Mrs. Fitzgerald is very eager to undo the trick and stretches the arms and hold with Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson also stretches her hands forward. Mrs. Pearson asks Mrs. Fitzgerald stay quiet for a while till she performs the magic tricks. They undergo the same process and the real Mrs. Fitzgerald whispers the same words. They transmit the now finally complete and successful. Now both of them are in their own bodies. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who got up the play of the role of Mrs. Pearson, expresses that she had fun during the process, but Mrs. Pearson denied. Mrs. Fitzgerald warns Mrs. Pearson not to go easy on them again, and otherwise all efforts would go waste. She replies that she will try her best. Mrs. Fitzgerald, she said that time available to her was not satisfactory, as an hour or two of the same treatment would leave a lasting impression. Mrs. Pearson lets her know that she's certain some change all is unsure about is now she will clarify things. She warns her not to go apologizing for the treatment, as it would reverse the effect of all hard work. Right. So, what Mrs. Fitzgerald said, Mrs. Pearson, with the spirit, it's all right for you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. After all, they are not your husband and children. Mrs. Fitzgerald, impressively, now you listen to me. You admitted yourself you were spoiling them and they didn't appreciate you. Any apologies, any explanation, and you will be straight back where you were. I am warning you, dear, just give them a look, a tone of voice, and again to suggest you might to be tough with them if you wanted to be, and it ought to work. Anyhow, we can't test it. We can test it. Mrs. Pearson, how? Mrs. Pearson said, how? Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, what is it you'd like them to do that they don't do? Stop at home for once. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, and give me a hand with supper. Mrs. Fitzgerald, anything you would like them to do that you enjoy whether they do or not. Mrs. Pearson hesitating, well, yes, I like a nice game or rummy, but of course I hardly ever once except at Christmas. Mrs. Fitzgerald, getting up, that will do then. She moves towards the left door and then turns, but remember, keep firm or you have had it. She opens the door calling, hoy, you can come in now. coming away from the door and moving right slightly quietly, but remember, a firm hand. George, Doris and Cyril file in through the doorway, looking apprehensively, and Mrs. Pearson, I'm just off to let you enjoy yourself. The family looks anxiously at Mrs. Pearson, who smiles much relieved. They smiles back at her. Doris anxiously, yes mother. Mrs. Pearson is smiling, seeing that you don't want to go. Oh, out. I tell you what I thought we would be. Mrs. Fitzgerald, giving a final warning, remember. Mrs. Pearson, nodding, looking sharply at the family, no objection, I hope. George humbly, no mother, whatever you say. Mrs. Pearson, smiling, I thought we would have a nice family game of running them. Then you children could get the supper ready with while I have talked with father. George, formally suits me. He looks challengingly at the children. What about you two? Cyril, hastily, yes, that's all right. Doris hesitating. Well, Mrs. Pearson sharply, what? Speak up. Doris hesitated hastily. Oh, I think it would be lovely. Mrs. Pearson smiling. Goodbye, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Come again soon. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes dear. Night all. Have a nice time. Mrs. Fitzgerald exits and left, and the family clusters around mother as. Right. So, when she wants her not to get apologies, right, and Mrs. Fitzgerald makes her aware that it was Mrs. Pearson who accepted that they are spoiled brats who did not appreciate her. Mrs. Pearson even said that she wanted things to improve. So Mrs. Fitzgerald again emphasized that any apology would bring them back to being rude to her. She goes to the extent of saying that being dominating once in a while would keep them on track. She says that Mrs. Pearson can even test if she wants. She adds that she also wants them to give her a hand of preparing even meal. Mrs. Fitzgerald asks her the name of one thing that they are reluctant to do, but Mrs. Pearson wants them to, for example, staying at home once in a while. She further asks if there is anything she likes to do, respectively of whatever they like doing it or not. Mrs. Pearson hesitates at first but tells Mrs. Fitzgerald that she likes to play rummy, but she only gets to play it at Christmas. While moving towards the door, she once again emphasizes how important it is for Mrs. Pearson to be little strict. Mrs. Pearson then calls George, Cyril and Doris inside, after which she leaves. Mrs. Pearson smiles at her family. Somehow relieved, they all smile back. And here, Doris speaks up first, a bit nervous, still smiling. She says she knows exactly what they should do since they are not going out. While leaving, Mrs. Fitzgerald reminds Mrs. Pearson again. Mrs. Pearson nods in attempt to show that she remembers whatever Mrs. Fitzgerald told her. And she asks her family if they have any objection. He says in a polite way that no. She very politely tells them that she wishes to play rummy with them. After that, she would like the children to help cook supper so that they can talk to George. And George agrees, but while looking at the children in a testing way and asks about their opinion. Cyril instantly agrees, and Doris hesitating, but after a bold statement of Mrs. Pearson, Doris also agrees. Right? Mrs. Pearson smiles at Mrs. Fitzgerald, wishing her goodbye, and Mrs. Fitzgerald exits left, and the family cluster around the mother as the curtain falls. So, dear students, you can see the story has been finished right now, and definitely we have cleared I hope you have cleared the explanation also कि इस लेसन की बेसिकली कहानी क्या थी. कहानी यही थी कि कैसे एक लेडी जो है वो अपने जो है राइट्स के लिए फ़ाइट करती है. हम देखते हैं कि कैसे हमारे घर की महिलाएं जो हैं वो सफ़र करती हैं, बहुत स्ट्रगल करती हैं, एंड आफ्टर ऑल उनकी एक जो पोजीशन, उनको एक प्रॉपर पोजीशन हमारे घर में नहीं दी जा पाती है, हम उनकी प्रॉपर केयरिंग नहीं कर पाते हैं. राइट. सो स्टूडेंट्स, you will have to just watch the video again and again, and definitely if you are getting problem, you are free to ask inside there. Right. So dear students, we will meet in the next segment. Up to the time, thank you, have a nice day.